The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle as Thomas Henderson adjusted his red uniform jacket for what he believed would be another ordinary day. At 62, Thomas had served the Royal Guard for over 4 decades, witnessing coronations, funerals, celebrations, and quiet moments that defined the monarchy's legacy. His weathered hands bore the calluses of countless hours standing at attention, and his steel-gray eyes had seen more royal secrets than most historians could imagine. Thomas had begun his service as a young man of 22, fresh from military training and burning with pride to serve the crown. Over the years, he had evolved from an eager recruit to a trusted guardian of royal tradition. He knew every corridor of the castle, every hidden passage, and every protocol that governed royal life. More importantly, he understood the weight of history that rested within these walls. The castle seemed unusually quiet that Tuesday morning in October. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter, but inside the ancient fortress, something felt different. Thomas noticed it immediately during his morning rounds. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press against the very stones of the building. As he walked through the state apartments, Thomas reflected on the changes he had witnessed over his long career. He had served under 3 monarchs, watched as traditions evolved and adapted to modern times. He had seen the royal family navigate scandals, celebrations, losses, and triumphs. Through it all, certain elements remained constant: duty, honor, and the preservation of the crown's dignity. The Queen's death 18 months earlier had shaken the very foundations of everything Thomas held dear. She had been more than a monarch to him, she had been the embodiment of everything he swore to protect. Her passing left a void that seemed impossible to fill, and the transition to the new reign had brought its own challenges and adjustments. Thomas paused before a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II in her coronation robes, the St. Edward's crown gleaming from the painted canvas. He remembered the day she died, how the entire castle had seemed to hold its breath. The protocols had been followed perfectly, the transition managed with military precision, but the emotional impact lingered like morning mist that refused to lift. The new king had brought his own style to the monarchy, along with his queen consort. Changes were inevitable, Thomas understood that, but some transformations cut deeper than others. The staff had learned to navigate new preferences, new routines, new ways of doing things that had remained unchanged for decades. That morning, Thomas received an unusual assignment from his superior, Captain Morrison. A special viewing was being arranged in the jewel room for potential buyers interested in acquiring certain pieces from the royal collection. The news struck Thomas like a physical blow. In all his years of service, he had never heard of such a thing. Buyers? Thomas had asked, his voice betraying his confusion. Captain Morrison, a man 20 years Thomas's junior, shifted uncomfortably. Orders from above, Henderson. A private auction house has been granted access to assess certain items for potential sale. It's all been approved at the highest levels. The explanation did nothing to ease Thomas's growing unease. As he made his way to the jewel room, his mind raced with questions and concerns. The crown jewels were not mere objects, they were sacred symbols of the monarchy's continuity, artifacts that connected the present to centuries of royal history. The jewel room itself was a shrine to British heritage. Behind bulletproof glass lay treasures that had witnessed the coronation of kings and queens, objects that embodied the very soul of the monarchy. The imperial state crown, the sovereign's orb, the scepters, each piece told a story of power, tradition, and unbroken lineage. Thomas positioned himself at his assigned post, watching as representatives from Hartwell and Associates, one of London's most prestigious auction houses, entered the sacred space. They moved with the clinical efficiency of appraisers, their eyes calculating values rather than appreciating history. Leading the group was Miranda Hartwell, a woman in her 50s whose reputation in the art and antiquities world was legendary. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling priceless objects, but, to Thomas, her presence felt like a violation of everything he held sacred. Magnificent, she murmured as she approached the display cases, her assistant taking detailed photographs and notes. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, of course, but the provenance makes these pieces truly exceptional. Thomas watched in growing horror as the appraisers examined each item with the detached interest of merchants evaluating inventory. Their clinical approach to objects that represented centuries of royal tradition felt like sacrilege to the veteran guard. Then came the moment that would change everything. Miranda paused before a particular display case, her eyes focusing on a crown that seemed to glow under the carefully controlled lighting. It was Queen Alexandra's Kokoshnik tiara, a stunning piece created in 1888, but it wasn't the tiara that had captured her attention. Beside it sat a smaller, more delicate crown that Thomas knew well, Queen Mary's fringe tiara, later worn by Queen Elizabeth on her wedding day. This piece, Miranda said, pointing to the Queen's wedding crown, has particular significance for our client. The connection to the late Queen's personal history makes it extremely valuable, especially given the current circumstances. Her assistant nodded, making additional notes. The Camilla connection will certainly drive up interest among collectors. The words hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. Camilla connection. The pieces suddenly fell into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a random sale of royal artifacts. This was something far more personal, far more devastating to the monarchy's integrity. Thomas had heard whispers in recent months about financial pressures, about the need to modernize and streamline royal expenses. But the idea that pieces directly connected to the late Queen's most intimate moments would be sold to private collectors was beyond his comprehension. The Queen's wedding crown wasn't just a valuable artifact, it was a symbol of love, commitment, and the beginning of a reign that had defined an era. The thought that it might soon sit in some billionaire's private collection rather than remain as part of Britain's heritage made Thomas's blood run cold. As the appraisers continued their work, Thomas found himself remembering the day of the Queen's wedding in 1947. He hadn't been born then, but he had heard the stories countless times from older guards, had seen the photographs that captured the young princess's radiant joy as she wore that very crown. It represented hope, love, and the promise of a future that had ultimately lasted over 70 years. The irony wasn't lost on him that pieces connected to the late Queen's legacy were being evaluated for sale while her daughter-in-law, now Queen Consort, continued to establish her own place in royal history. The implications were staggering, and Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders. Miranda's voice cut through his thoughts. We'll need detailed provenance documentation for each piece, naturally. Our client is particularly interested in items with strong emotional connections to the royal family. Personal significance often drives value in ways that pure historical importance cannot. Thomas clenched his fists behind his back, struggling to maintain his professional composure. The casual way she discussed the sale of the monarchy's most precious artifacts felt like watching vandals desecrate a cathedral. Throughout the morning, the appraisers catalogued piece after piece, their voices a constant murmur of valuations and assessments. Each item they examined represented decades or even centuries of royal history, yet they treated them as mere commodities in an upscale marketplace. The breaking point came when Miranda's assistant suggested moving the Queen's wedding crown to better lighting for more detailed photography. If we're going to market this piece effectively, we need images that capture every detail. The story sells as much as the object itself. Something inside Thomas snapped. The idea that the Queen's wedding crown would be marketed like a luxury handbag or expensive watch was more than he could bear. This wasn't just about preserving artifacts, it was about protecting the very soul of the institution he had served his entire adult life. As he watched the assistant reach toward the display case controls, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. For decades of service, countless moments of unwavering loyalty, and a deep love for the crown's dignity crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. The weight of his responsibility had never felt heavier, but Thomas Henderson knew exactly what he had to do. The question wasn't whether he should act, but whether he was brave enough to accept the consequences of standing up for what he believed was right. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the ancient windows of the jewel room, casting new shadows across the precious artifacts that had defined his life's work. In a few hours, his shift would end, and he would return to his modest flat in Windsor Town. But Thomas knew that this day would be different from all the others. As he stood guard over treasures that represented the continuity of the British monarchy, Thomas Henderson prepared to make the most important decision of his long and faithful career. The crown jewels would remain under his protection for a few more hours, but the real test of his loyalty was about to begin. The story of what happened next would ripple through the corridors of power, challenge the very foundations of royal protocol, and force everyone involved to confront the true meaning of duty, honor, and the preservation of history. Thomas didn't know it yet, but his actions in the coming hours would make him either a hero or a traitor, depending on one's perspective. What he did know was that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the personal cost. The decision crystallized in Thomas's mind like ice forming on a winter pond. As Miranda's assistant prepared to photograph the Queen's wedding crown for what he now understood was a sales catalog, Thomas stepped forward with the quiet authority that 4 decades of service had given him. "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow that to proceed," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The room fell silent. Miranda turned to face him, her expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Excuse me? We have full authorization for this appraisal. I believe there's been some misunderstanding." Thomas maintained his position between the appraisers and the display case. "I understand you have authorization, ma'am. However, I've served this crown for 43 years, and I cannot stand by while pieces of our national heritage are prepared for sale to private collectors." The tension in the room became palpable. Miranda's assistant looked nervously between his employer and the guard, uncertain how to proceed. This was clearly outside the scope of anything they had anticipated. "Young man," Miranda said, her tone taking on the condescending edge of someone accustomed to getting her way, "you clearly don't understand the situation. This sale has been approved at the highest levels of the royal household. Your job is to provide security, not to question royal decisions." Thomas felt a flush of anger at being called young man by someone who couldn't possibly understand the depth of his commitment to the crown. "Ma'am, with respect, my job is to protect these treasures from any threat to their security or integrity. That includes protecting them from being sold into private hands where they'll be lost to the British people forever." The confrontation might have escalated further if Captain Morrison hadn't arrived at that moment, drawn by reports of the unusual standoff in the jewel room. His face immediately darkened when he saw Thomas blocking access to the display cases. "Henderson, step aside immediately," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of rank and procedure. Thomas turned to face his superior, a man he respected but who had never understood the emotional weight of protecting royal heritage. "Sir, I request clarification on the authorization for this sale. Which member of the royal family has personally approved the disposal of the late Queen's wedding crown?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Morrison's hesitation was telling. In all the paperwork and authorizations that had crossed his desk, there had been departmental approvals, financial justifications, and legal clearances, but no direct royal signature on the specific items to be sold. "The authorization comes through proper channels, Henderson. That's all you need to know," Morrison replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Sir, I've seen proper royal authorizations for 43 years. They bear the personal signature or seal of the sovereign. Has His Majesty personally signed an order authorizing the sale of his mother's wedding crown?" The specificity of the question created an uncomfortable silence. Morrison knew, as did everyone in the room, that such a personal and emotionally significant item would require direct royal approval, not just administrative clearance. Miranda, sensing the shifting dynamic, attempted to regain control. "This is highly irregular. We have contracts and commitments to our client. Any delays could have serious financial implications." Thomas finally understood the full scope of what was happening. "Who is your client, ma'am? Who exactly is purchasing pieces of British royal heritage?" "That information is confidential," Miranda replied quickly, but her assistant had already let slip too much information earlier. "You mentioned a Camilla connection earlier," Thomas pressed. "What exactly did you mean by that?" The question exposed the true complexity of the situation. The items being sold weren't random pieces from the royal collection. They had been specifically chosen for their connections to the late Queen's personal life, particularly pieces that might be seen as less relevant to the new Queen consort's role. Morrison realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his ability to control. "Henderson, you're relieved of duty. Report to the duty office immediately." "Sir, I respectfully refuse," Thomas replied. "I took an oath to protect the crown and its treasures. I cannot abandon that duty when it matters most." The standoff had reached a critical point. Morrison could have called for additional security to physically remove Thomas, but doing so would create exactly the kind of incident that the royal household worked desperately to avoid. Any use of force against a veteran guard protecting royal artifacts would inevitably leak to the press, creating a public relations nightmare. Meanwhile, word of the confrontation had begun to spread through the castle's staff network. Servants who had worked alongside Thomas for decades heard whispers of his stand against the sale of royal treasures. Many of them shared his concerns but had felt powerless to voice them. Margaret Whitmore, the head housekeeper who had served the late Queen for 37 years, arrived at the jewel room with several other long-serving staff members. Her presence immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. "Thomas, dear, what's happening here?" she asked, her voice carrying the maternal authority that came from decades of managing royal households. Thomas explained the situation in clear, simple terms. The sale, the specific items involved, and his belief that proper authorization had not been obtained. Margaret's face grew increasingly grave as she listened. "The Queen's wedding crown," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "But that was her most treasured piece. She told me once that wearing it on her wedding day was the moment she truly understood the weight of her future responsibilities." Margaret's words carried special significance because everyone knew of her close relationship with the late Queen. She had been one of the few staff members who had regular personal conversations with the monarch, and her insights into the Queen's private feelings were invaluable. "Margaret, this isn't your concern," Morrison said, but his authority was clearly eroding as more senior staff members gathered. "Captain Morrison," Margaret replied with the quiet dignity that had made her indispensable to the royal household, "everything that concerns the late Queen's legacy is my concern. I was with her when she chose what pieces she wanted preserved for future generations." The wedding crown was specifically mentioned as something that should never leave the royal collection. This revelation created another uncomfortable moment. If the late Queen had indeed expressed wishes about the preservation of specific items, selling them could be seen as violating her final instructions. Miranda, realizing that her carefully planned appraisal was degenerating into a staff revolt, attempted to reassert professional control. "This is all very touching, but we have legal contracts and binding agreements. These items have been designated for sale through proper legal channels." "Legal channels that may not have included proper royal consultation," Thomas replied firmly. The truth was becoming increasingly clear to everyone in the room. The sale had been organized through administrative channels, possibly to streamline the process and avoid the emotional complications that direct royal involvement might create. But, in bypassing the personal approval of the king, the organizers had created exactly the kind of institutional conflict they had hoped to avoid. At that moment, word arrived that Private Secretary to the King, Sir Edmund Fairfax, was requesting an immediate meeting with all parties involved. The situation had escalated to the highest levels of royal administration, exactly what everyone had hoped to prevent. As they waited for Sir Edmund's arrival, Thomas reflected on what his actions had set in motion. He had potentially ended his career, certainly embarrassed his superiors, and created exactly the kind of controversy that the royal household worked tirelessly to avoid. Yet he felt a peace he hadn't experienced in months. The late Queen had been more than his sovereign, she had been the living embodiment of the values and traditions he had sworn to protect. The idea that her most personal possessions would be sold to fund administrative efficiencies felt like a betrayal of everything she had represented. Margaret moved to stand beside Thomas, her presence offering silent support for his position. Soon, other long-serving staff members had joined them, creating an unprecedented display of unified resistance to administrative decisions. 43 years I've served this crown," Thomas said quietly, addressing Morrison but speaking to everyone in the room. "I've never questioned orders, never challenged authority, never put my personal feelings above my duty. But duty isn't just following orders. Sometimes duty means standing up for the values those orders are supposed to protect." Miranda's assistant was frantically making phone calls, trying to reach superiors who could resolve the situation. The delay was costing money and potentially jeopardizing contracts, but the auction house was caught between their business obligations and an unexpectedly complex royal protocol issue. As they waited, Thomas found himself thinking about all the changes he had witnessed over his long career. Some changes had been positive adaptations to modern realities. Others had felt like small betrayals of tradition. But the sale of the Queen's wedding crown felt like something qualitatively different, a fundamental break with the continuity that gave the monarchy its meaning and legitimacy. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Sir Edmund's arrival. As private secretary to the king, he was one of the most powerful figures in the royal administration, someone whose word carried almost royal authority. His decision would likely determine not just the fate of the crown sale, but Thomas's future as well. Sir Edmund entered the jewel room with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing crises. At 68, he had served in royal administration for over 3 decades and had navigated countless delicate situations. His expression gave no hint of his thoughts as he surveyed the unprecedented scene before him. The confrontation that had begun with a veteran guard's refusal to allow the photographing of a crown was about to become a defining moment for the new reign's relationship with tradition, heritage, and the deeper meaning of royal service. Sir Edmund Fairfax surveyed the extraordinary scene before him with the measured calm of someone who had spent decades managing royal crises. The sight of a veteran guard standing defiant against superior orders while surrounded by supportive staff was unlike anything he had encountered in his long career. The implications were staggering, not just for palace protocol, but for the monarchy itself. "Good afternoon, everyone," Sir Edmund said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him indispensable to 3 generations of royals. "I understand there's been some disagreement about today's proceedings." Thomas stepped forward, maintaining his respectful posture despite the gravity of his situation. "Sir Edmund, I've taken the liberty of halting the appraisal process until proper authorization can be verified. Specifically, I'm requesting confirmation that His Majesty has personally approved the sale of his late mother's wedding crown." The directness of the question impressed Sir Edmund, even as it complicated his position. He had spent the previous hour reviewing the paperwork surrounding the proposed sales, and Thomas's concern was more valid than anyone had initially realized. "Thomas, may I call you Thomas? You've raised an important procedural question," Sir Edmund replied thoughtfully. "However, your method of raising it has created some complications." Miranda Hartwell stepped forward, her patience clearly exhausted. "Sir Edmund, with respect, we have binding contracts with our client. These delays are creating serious legal and financial exposures for all parties involved." "Ms. Hartwell," Sir Edmund replied coolly, "I'm afraid your contracts may have been premature. The items in question require a level of authorization that appears to have been overlooked in the administrative process." The admission sent ripples through the assembled group. Morrison's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized that his certainty about the proper authorizations had been misplaced. The procedures that governed the sale of royal artifacts were labyrinthine, and it was becoming clear that several critical steps had been bypassed. "Are you saying the sale cannot proceed?" Miranda demanded, her professional composure beginning to crack. "I'm saying that before any sale can proceed, we need to ensure that all protocols have been properly followed," Sir Edmund replied diplomatically. "This includes obtaining explicit royal approval for items of particular historical or personal significance." Margaret Whitmore cleared her throat softly, drawing Sir Edmund's attention. "Sir, if I may, I believe I have relevant information about the late Queen's wishes regarding these particular pieces." Sir Edmund nodded for her to continue, recognizing both her seniority and her unique relationship with the late monarch. "Her Majesty spoke to me on several occasions about her hopes for preserving certain personal items for future generations. The wedding crown was specifically mentioned as something she wanted to remain with the crown estate permanently. She felt it represented the continuity between her personal happiness and her public duty." The revelation created a profound silence in the room. If the late Queen had indeed expressed specific wishes about the preservation of these items, proceeding with their sale could be seen as violating her final instructions to the royal household. Thomas felt a wave of validation wash over him. His instinctive reaction to protect the crown hadn't been mere sentimentality, it had been aligned with the late Queen's own expressed wishes. Sir Edmund absorbed this information carefully. "Margaret, do you have any documentation of these conversations?" "No formal documentation, sir, but these conversations took place in the presence of several other senior staff members over the years. The Queen was quite clear about her feelings on the matter." Miranda's assistant was furiously taking notes, clearly calculating the legal implications of proceeding with a sale that might contradict the previous sovereign's expressed wishes. The potential for future legal challenges was becoming increasingly apparent. "This is preposterous," Miranda declared. "Are we to halt major business transactions based on undocumented conversations and the emotional reactions of palace staff?" Her dismissive tone struck exactly the wrong note with everyone present. The emotional reactions she was dismissing represented decades of faithful service and deep understanding of royal traditions and values. Thomas stepped forward again, his voice steady but filled with quiet passion. "Miss Hartwell, with respect, what you call emotional reactions are actually the institutional memory of this monarchy. We are the people who have daily responsibility for preserving and protecting the crown's heritage. Our concerns aren't based on sentiment alone, they're based on understanding what these objects mean to the continuity and legitimacy of the institution we serve." Sir Edmund found himself impressed by the guard's eloquence and depth of understanding. It was becoming clear that Thomas's resistance wasn't mere insubordination, but rather a principled stand based on legitimate concerns about proper procedures and respect for royal heritage. "Thomas raises valid points," Sir Edmund acknowledged. "The sale of royal artifacts isn't simply a business transaction. Each piece carries historical, symbolic, and emotional significance that must be carefully weighed against any financial benefits." Morrison, realizing that his handling of the situation had been inadequate, attempted to reassert his authority. "Sir Edmund, with respect, we cannot allow individual staff members to override authorized procedures based on personal opinions." "Captain Morrison," Sir Edmund replied firmly, "what we have here isn't a case of individual staff members overriding procedures. What we have is evidence that the procedures themselves may have been inadequate. Thomas's intervention, while irregular in its execution, may have prevented a significant error in judgment." The acknowledgement of Thomas's position as potentially correct rather than merely insubordinate represented a crucial shift in the power dynamics of the confrontation. It also highlighted the complexity of managing an institution where tradition, protocol, and human judgment sometimes conflicted. At that moment, word arrived that the situation had reached an even higher level. The king himself had been informed of the controversy and was requesting a private meeting with Sir Edmund immediately. The implications were staggering, the monarch's personal intervention in what had begun as a routine administrative matter. "I'm afraid we'll need to suspend all proceedings until I've had the opportunity to brief His Majesty on the situation," Sir Edmund announced. "Miss Hartwell, I apologize for the inconvenience, but I'm sure you understand the necessity of ensuring proper royal approval before proceeding." Miranda's frustration was palpable, but she recognized that challenging the private secretary's decision would be futile. "This delay will have serious consequences for our contractual obligations," she warned. "Those consequences will be addressed through proper channels," Sir Edmund assured her. "For now, I must ask everyone to maintain absolute confidentiality about today's events while we work to resolve the situation appropriately." As the auction house representatives gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. His intervention had succeeded in halting the sale, but the ultimate consequences for his career and the monarchy's future remained uncertain. Margaret Whitmore approached him as the room began to clear. "Thomas, you did the right thing," she said softly. "The Queen would have been proud of your courage." Her words meant more to him than any official recognition could have. Margaret's approval carried the weight of someone who had known the late Queen's mind and heart better than almost anyone else. Sir Edmund remained behind as the others departed, studying Thomas with newfound respect. "Your actions today were highly irregular," he said finally. "Yes, sir, they were," Thomas replied honestly. "They were also, I'm beginning to believe, absolutely necessary," Sir Edmund continued. "The administrative process failed to account for the full significance of what was being proposed. Your intervention may have saved us from a decision that could have permanently damaged the Crown's relationship with the British people." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. While his future remained uncertain, he had acted according to his deepest convictions about duty and service. "Sir, may I ask what will happen now?" Thomas inquired. "Now, I must explain to His Majesty how a routine estate sale nearly resulted in the disposal of his mother's wedding crown without his personal knowledge or approval," Sir Edmund replied with a slight smile. I suspect he will have strong opinions about the administrative processes that allowed this situation to develop. The implications were clear. The king's reaction to learning that such personally significant items had nearly been sold without his knowledge would likely result in major changes to how royal collections were managed and what level of approval was required for different types of transactions. As Thomas prepared to return to his duties, he reflected on the extraordinary events of the day. A routine morning assignment had become a defining moment not just for his own career, but potentially for how the new reign would balance tradition with modernization. The Queen's wedding crown remained safely in its display case, protected not by bulletproof glass alone, but by the dedication of people who understood that some things transcended mere monetary value. The confrontation that had begun with one guard's refusal to allow a photograph had revealed deep questions about the monarchy's values, priorities, and respect for its own heritage. Sir Edmund's meeting with the king would determine not just the fate of the proposed sales, but the future direction of royal collections management. Thomas had set in motion a chain of events that would force the monarchy to confront fundamental questions about what it meant to preserve and protect royal heritage in the modern era. The afternoon sun was setting over Windsor Castle as Thomas resumed his duties, knowing that he had fundamentally altered the course of events through his willingness to stand up for his deepest convictions about duty, honor, and the protection of irreplaceable symbols of British heritage. The private audience between Sir Edmund Fairfax and His Majesty King Charles III took place in the Oak Room, a space that had witnessed countless moments of royal decision-making throughout the centuries. The king sat behind the same desk his mother had used for decades, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and the weight of inherited responsibility. Edmund, the king began, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and bewilderment, please explain to me how my mother's wedding crown came to be evaluated for sale without my knowledge. Sir Edmund had prepared for this moment during his walk to the king's study, but the directness of the question still struck him with its full implications. Your Majesty, it appears there was a breakdown in the authorization process. The administrative staff believed they had sufficient authority to proceed with estate optimization recommendations without requiring your personal approval for individual items. King Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. Estate optimization. Is that what they're calling it? His voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades watching bureaucratic language obscure human realities. Edmund, that crown represents one of the happiest days of my mother's life. The idea that it would be sold to fund optimization is deeply troubling. The king's reaction was stronger than Sir Edmund had anticipated, revealing depths of feeling that the administrative process had completely failed to consider. Your Majesty, if I may, there's more to the story. The sale was halted by the intervention of a veteran guard named Thomas Henderson. A guard intervened? The king's eyebrows rose in surprise. Yes, Your Majesty. He physically prevented the auction house representatives from proceeding with their appraisal, stating that he could not allow royal heritage to be sold without proper authorization. His actions, while technically insubordinate, may have prevented an irreversible mistake. King Charles was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what he was hearing. This guard, Henderson, he understood the significance of what was happening better than my own administrative staff. It appears so, Your Majesty. He served the crown for 43 years and expressed deep concerns about the sale of items with particular historical and emotional significance. The king rose from his desk and walked to the window overlooking the castle grounds. In the distance, he could see the everyday activities of the staff who kept the royal household functioning: gardeners, security personnel, housekeepers, all of them dedicated to preserving the institution he now led. Edmund, I want to meet this guard, the king said suddenly. If he understood my mother's legacy better than the people charged with protecting it administratively, I need to hear his perspective directly. Sir Edmund was surprised by the request, but it aligned with the king's well-known preference for direct engagement with the people who served the crown at every level. I'll arrange for Mr. Henderson to be brought to you immediately, Your Majesty. 20 minutes later, Thomas Henderson found himself standing in the Oak Room, face to face with the monarch he had served his entire adult life. Despite his decades of experience with royal protocol, the personal nature of this audience was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Mr. Henderson, the king began, his tone both formal and genuinely warm, I understand you took some extraordinary actions today to protect my mother's wedding crown. Thomas stood at attention, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Your Majesty, I believed that proper authorization had not been obtained for the sale of items of such personal and historical significance. The king studied Thomas carefully, seeing in him the embodiment of the faithful service that had been the backbone of the monarchy for generations. Tell me, in your own words, what concerned you most about today's proceedings? Thomas had not expected such a direct invitation to share his thoughts, but the king's genuine interest gave him courage to speak from his heart. Your Majesty, that crown represents more than its monetary value or even its historical importance. It was part of your mother's happiness, part of the story of her love for your father and her commitment to her role as queen. The idea that it would be sold to a private collector felt like we were betraying not just her memory, but the very continuity that gives the crown its meaning. The king was visibly moved by Thomas's words. Here was someone who understood that the monarchy's power came not from its wealth or administrative efficiency, but from its ability to embody continuity, tradition, and shared values across generations. You mentioned proper authorization, the king continued. What exactly did you mean by that? Your Majesty, in my experience, items of such personal significance to the royal family require your direct approval. The administrative processes that led to today's appraisal appeared to bypass that level of consideration. The king nodded slowly. You were absolutely correct, Mr. Henderson. The sale of my mother's wedding crown, or any item of similar personal significance, would require my explicit and informed consent. That consent was never sought, and, had I known what was being proposed, it would not have been given. The confirmation of Thomas's position was both vindication and relief. His instincts about proper procedure had been correct, and his intervention had indeed prevented what the king now acknowledged would have been an inappropriate decision. Your Majesty, Thomas ventured, there's something else you should know. Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, has informed us that the late queen specifically expressed wishes about preserving that crown for future generations. She felt it should never leave the royal collection. The king's expression grew even more serious. My mother discussed this with the household staff? Yes, Your Majesty. Mrs. Whitmore recalls several conversations over the years where the Queen mentioned her hopes for preserving certain personal items that represented important moments in her life and reign. King Charles was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the full implications of what he was learning. His mother had not only treasured these items personally, but had actively expressed wishes about their preservation that the administrative process had completely ignored. Mr. Henderson, the king said finally, your actions today demonstrated a level of understanding and commitment to the crown's true interests that I find both admirable and necessary. You recognize that duty sometimes requires standing up for principles even when it conflicts with orders. Thomas felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Your Majesty. I've tried to serve the crown with honor for over 4 decades. And you have succeeded admirably, the king replied. Now, I have some difficult questions to ask my administrative staff about how this situation developed and how we can ensure it never happens again. Sir Edmund, who had been quietly observing this exchange, recognized that the conversation was leading toward significant changes in how royal collections would be managed in the future. The king turned to him. Edmund, I want a complete review of all proposed sales and a new protocol that ensures items of personal or exceptional historical significance receive my direct review before any action is taken. Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I also review the contracts with Hartwell and Associates? Cancel them, the king said firmly. Any auction house that would proceed with the sale of my mother's personal items without ensuring proper royal authorization is not worthy of our business. The decision represented more than just the cancellation of a business relationship. It was a statement about the values and priorities that would guide the new reign's approach to balancing tradition with modernization. As the meeting concluded, the king had one final message for Thomas. Mr. Henderson, I want you to know that your intervention today has done more than preserve a crown. It has reminded all of us that the monarchy's greatest strength lies not in its administrative efficiency, but in the dedication of people like you who understand that some things are worth protecting regardless of their financial value. Thomas left the Oak Room with a renewed sense of purpose and pride. His career, which he had thought might be ending that morning, had instead been given new meaning and recognition at the highest possible level. Word of the king's support for Thomas's actions spread quickly through the castle staff. The veteran guard who had risked his career to protect the queen's wedding crown had not only been vindicated, but had been personally thanked by the monarch himself. Margaret Whitmore sought out Thomas that evening as his shift ended. "The queen would have been so proud of you," she said, echoing her words from earlier in the day. "You did what she would have wanted, you protected not just her crown, but the values it represents." In the days that followed, significant changes were implemented in the royal household's procedures. All proposed sales of royal artifacts would now require detailed historical and provenance reviews, and items of particular personal significance would automatically require the king's direct approval. The auction house incident became a turning point in how the new reign approached the balance between modernization and tradition. Rather than viewing efficiency and heritage preservation as competing priorities, the king's response to Thomas's intervention demonstrated that protecting the monarchy's deepest values was itself a form of modernization. Thomas Henderson returned to his duties with renewed purpose, knowing that his 4 decades of faithful service had culminated in a moment when his understanding of duty had aligned perfectly with his sovereign's deepest convictions. The Queen's wedding crown remained safely in its place, protected not just by glass and security systems, but by the commitment of people who understood that some symbols of heritage and continuity were truly priceless. The story of the guard who stopped the sale